And welcome back to the show. The Writers Come Out at Night. Its story is a culmination of over 21 years of fearless reporting, as well as some in-depth journalism, shining the light on the problems right within the Oakland Police Department in Oakland, California. A history of violence, secrecy, brutality, and more. Joining us now to share a little bit more, we've got the co-author of The Writers Come Out at Night. We've got Winston with us. And Ali, glad to have you with us, and thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor.
Well, it's a privilege to be able to talk to you, and you go in depth, really talking about the issues of the Oakland Police Department. In a time when police brutality is in question, you hear words like defund the police. You got a book out, and it really is pretty scathing when it comes to talking about the issues within the Oakland Police Department.
Yeah, I mean, I was a reporter I've covered Oakland PD and law enforcement in California since about 2008. Been a reporter for 17 years now. And it is a city that's a little bit unique. It's like a lot of other cities in the US, 400,000 people. Most American cities are not like, New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago. They're smaller. And at the same time, Oakland also has a pretty left-wing constituency. In terms of its population, it's very mixed up racially. It has gone through the problems of deindustrialization, white flight, serious narcotics fueled violence in the 1970s, 80s, 90s through today. And it's also currently undergoing a lot of the throes of, gentrification and urban renewal that began in the 1990s with a Giuliani style urban renewal zero tolerance program put in place by then mayor and later governor for the second time, Jerry Brown. But we actually took an approach to reported on my colleague Darwin Von Graham and I, with whom I wrote this book, we reported on OPD together since 2012 together, side by side. And we kind of decided to zoom back a little bit on the kind of drumbeat of scandal that we would cover and look at why the police department in Oakland was so troubled. It's been under a reform program for 20 years as a result of a scandal involving four very, very, very brutal officers. I won't say rogue because it was kind of widely known within the police department what they were doing. And the fact that they would frame suspects, pummel them, elicit false confessions, frame them up, send them to jail, send them to prison. People would get falsely convicted on their evidence for narcotics related cases. And the department knew very well who these people were and actually honored several of them. They were considered, the best of the best. And when this scandal came out in 2000, it came out because a young officer named Keith Batt, who was assigned to field training with these cops in West Oakland, which at the time was predominantly African-American. It's a little bit less so now, more mixed up, but historically that has been the corner of the city where the African-American population gravitated to, especially during and after the Second World War. That's when the Black population in Oakland really mushroomed. At one point in the 1980s, it was about 50% African-American. It's about 25% Black now. But when Keith Batt he witnessed some of these horrific things in just 2 weeks on the job with these cops, he had enough and blew the whistle, went to internal affairs, turned them in. And as a result of, his actions and some civil lawsuits that followed, the police department was placed under a consent decree in 2003. We're hitting the 20th year of that this month. And OPD has not gotten out from under it yet. There's been a lot of backsliding, a lot of resistance, some progress, but by and large, it's right now, OPD's consent decree, their reform program is the longest running police reform effort in the country, in the United States history.
Yeah, and so when I take a look at this and I see the fact that Oakland has had this long systemic history of violence, of corruption, of all these things that you have, brutality, false convictions, now we're at the place of 20. And some have argued that not much has changed. You talked about the consent decree. Can you give me a little insight as to the community and the pulse within the community now and then? Or I should say, let me start then and now.
Sure. Well, as your listeners may or may not know, Oakland is the birthplace of the Black Panther Party. It really changed in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s from a city that was pretty much a relatively conservative, Republican-dominated majority white city into a very mixed up, progressive place where by the 1980s, I think there was a rough breakdown of like 40% African American, 30% white, 20% Latino, remainder Asian and Native American. At this point now it's about 30-30-30 and 30-30-30-20 and or 10. And it really is the sort of place where progressive politics came into the fore. The Black Panther Party were founded on the principle of community control of the police. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale were reacting to the brutality and the oppression of the Oakland Police Department of the African American community in the 1960s when they formed the Panthers. And then the movement spread throughout the country, and that's a whole nother history. But that sense of trying to get some sort of community control over law enforcement and getting to grips with the ways in which the American police system, and particularly in Oakland, it was very apparent, had developed as a measure of control of population. They developed to protect property and to control, restive social groups prior to the African American arrival in Oakland. And we trace this out in our book because we go back to 1850 something, the founding of the city. The police department were very focused in on keeping in line first the Chinese, who were the majority non-white group in the city, and they were a big part of the city's labor force, and left-wing radicals, because Oakland was an industrial city. It still is a pretty blue-collar place. And, there was a lot of labor unrest. There were huge raids on communists and anarchists and labor militants in the 1910s, 1920s. That continued all the way through the 1950s, when the local powers that be started to conflate African-American, advocacy for civil rights and equal treatment under the law with communism. And, that sense of pushing back against, the powers that be and trying to get some sort of community control over law enforcement and accountability for police really tracks ahead of the rest of the United States in a way. The first attempt at getting independent civilian oversight of police in Oakland, I believe, dates from 1980. A young man named Melvin Black was killed by the cops in a case where, they believed he had a gun. They believed he was an armed suspect. Nothing of the sort. They fired on him. And his murder actually triggered weeks of protest and huge calls for a independent police review board, which, sooner or later the city got. But that wave of advocacy, if you look at it in the national picture, tracks ahead of the rest of the country.
So for yourself, talk to me about where we are today. The book is out. You got some traction coming in terms of the public knows all about what happened in Oakland. What's been the reception to the book, given the fact that this is coming out and now you've got people who are seeing, and some people are actually seeing you hear this more in depth firsthand than you heard about it, but now you're actually going to be able to read about it.
Well, The Riders it's a very interesting story. So the actual deeper history of Oakland, it's been put together in bits and pieces, but no one's ever looked at the city through the lens of law enforcement. What we tried to do is a little bit what Mike Davis did, really recently deceased, brilliant sociologist who wrote very, very, very comprehensively about Southern California. He wrote a book in 1990 called City of Courts about Los Angeles, and it really talked about the design of Los Angeles as a city and a society around control and suppression of population. And he did a lot of that work through the lens of the LAPD, which, Oakland, the Oakland Police Department is like a Northern California corollary to the LAPD, which was very, very, very repressive, still is in a lot of ways towards the city's population, and also went through its own consent decree. So we tried to examine how the formation of the city really was, we tried to examine the history of the city through the central institution of Oakland, which is the police department. And in that process, we really tracked a lot of developments that were kind of lost to history, or not really in the public's eye as much as, say, the story of the Black Panther Party or the saga of Felix Mitchell, who is a very colorful drug baron in the 1980s. And, he has served, allegedly served as the inspiration for Nino Carter, and several other figures in pop culture history. But also the central scandal here that got OPD into the consent decree. That story has never really been pulled together and told in a comprehensive way. And it's, at this point within the police department, it's looked at as kind of, oh, well, those cops walked. They had 2 hung juries at 2 consecutive trials. One of them is still a fugitive in Mexico. He's down there to this day, presumably. And we actually wanted to retell the investigation with the help of, God knows how many documents that we got either through sources, or that we actually had to sue the city of Oakland for hundreds of thousands of pages of records about a number of police misconduct incidents down the years, thanks to a new California state law that passed in 2019. And we kind of pieced back this sequence of events and these stories together in granular detail. If your readers want to flip through the back of the book, you can look at our notes. There's court documents, transcripts, interview tapes, just a wealth of materials there that we use to piece together this history in real granular detail to kind of lay out just why and how things had gotten so bad in Oakland that, the need was apparent for a consent decree and for a reform program, and how over the succeeding 20 years, the city and the department have kind of taken 1 step forward, 2 steps backwards. And there's a string of events that we try and trends that we track through time, ranging from brutality towards protesters, really bad police involved shootings, police shootings of suspects, armed, unarmed, so forth, that lead to loss of life, not only of civilians, but also of police officers. In one case, there's a really tragic incident in 2009 involving a guy named Lavelle Mixon. Oscar Grant's story is in here as well, the young man who was murdered by a transit officer, not an Oakland officer, on New Year's Day in 2009. But his death and the succeeding protests around it, the trial of the cop that killed him as well, they really kind of coalesced a lot of the disparate energy in the city to a central movement, the Justice for Oscar Grant movement that, was fictionalized very well so, but it was created into the Fruitvale Station film with Michael B. Jordan. Ryan Coogler directed it. And in a way, we actually see that as kind of the prefiguring moment for the Black Lives Matter movement that burst into the national scene in 2013 and 14. Oakland was a really big site for that, but in a way, the kind of almost 3 years of agitation around Oscar Grant's murder and trying to get justice for his family and his survivors really did track ahead of the national debate on law enforcement and police in a very distinct way.
As I look now and I think about what was going on back then, I think about how intense it was, and it seems as though there were little more answers. When we talk about a consent decree right now, and the fact that the consent decree, the hiring of officers, a lot of other things are supposed to be in place, and still Oakland still comes up short. Where can we identify the big holdup? Because in order for change to happen, some things need to happen. And from your perspective, what is the big stumbling block in being able to turn the corner for the city of Oakland, for the city of Oakland with the police department?
Sure. Well, in the case of Oakland, our reporting showed at the time, and then retrospectively too, looking back to the years before I got to Oakland in 2008, that there's a tremendous amount of intransigence within the city. The consent decree essentially stayed. I had a former commander tell me the consent decree stayed in my desk drawer for 5 years, and it was originally a 5-year decree. Right, this thing has been renewed or extended 3 or 4 times. The consent decree is currently on its 2nd judge. The first judge, Thelton B. Henderson, who was a tremendous judge in the San Francisco District Court, he retired. And now it's on William B. Ork's docket. He's done a very assiduous job with the case. But really, the holdup is about internal culture and resistance from the police department to change. You have to realize that this is a department that, you know, pushed back against efforts to overhaul and reform its internal culture. Even in the 1970s, there's a really interesting case study in here about Charles Gaine, who was the police chief in the 1970s, a white man from family where I believe they migrated, they were Dust Bowl migrants. They left Texas to come to Oakland. And he grew up in Oakland, you know, back when the city was mostly white, but still mixed up. And he did not like the department's hard charging, like basically extremist right-wing culture. There were open John Birch Society members in the Oakland Police Department. A generation earlier, there were very, very close ties with the KKK. As by the way, there were with many, many, many California law enforcement agencies, including the Los Angeles Police Department, the DA's office in Alameda County, other sheriff's agencies. That's a whole different, that's a little nugget in here in the book as well. But realistically, there was intransigence from law enforcement, and there was no real political will, except for a couple people in the council every now and then. But before Oscar Grant's murder and the protests that broke out afterwards and led to, by the way, some incredibly violent repression. Then in 2011, the Occupy Oakland protests, which kind of were, I want to say, a little bit of a cross-pollination between the Oscar Grant movement, student protests from the University of California system as well, and then you know, broader national trends around Occupy Wall Street. They actually pushed the police department's failure to change at all into the public light. Also, you have to remember that during this period of time, Oakland it got more dangerous. The modern peak for violence, gun violence in Oakland, aside from the 1990s, which nationally is the highest we've had, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, so be it. The peak was in 2006. And, you know, over the years, you know, Oakland has had, depending on what sort of enforcement operations or strategies have been in place, violence has decreased and it's kind of ebbed and flowed. So the idea that reform creates dangerous cities and police departments that can't do their job is a misnomer. I think that's completely out. But lack of a political will as well has really, really, really harmed the city of Oakland. And you have to remember that the amount of money that the city of Oakland pays out in legal settlements, not just to keep the consent decree up and running, which they're obliged to do, and the citizens end up footing the bill for that, but also to pay for brutality settlements is really, it's out of proportion for what other California cities pay per capita and even on straight up dollar amount. Things have changed down the years. Police officers do shoot far fewer people now than they used to. And we detail that transition in our book. Some of it has to do with training. Some of it has to do with pursuit policies. Some of it has to do with the type of officer they recruit. There used to be a very strong trend to pulling in people who had recently demobilized from the military, especially during the years when the US was very deeply involved in Iraq and Afghanistan. There was a large pool of veterans that were brought in, and that, you know, worked itself out in one way or the other. But there have been efforts to change. Unfortunately, the problem is that because there is so much pressure from the mayor's office and from certain constituents and from the police union to get out from under the consent decree and clear the decks, that oftentimes when there is we've seen this and we detail it in the latter chapters, when there is a brewing scandal or something where some officer did something wrong, because, you know, it's a agency of 700 people. Every now and then somebody screws up and you know, gets drunk and beats somebody up or commits domestic violence or so on, and then they get held to account. Sometimes the department's instinct is to cover up that conduct and to make excuses for it, either because that officer is well liked or because this conduct could be seen as deleterious to the department and could hurt the public image. And that goes precisely against what the consent decree is supposed to do, because your internal affairs process is supposed to be transparent and forthright and effective. So the cover up ends up being worse than the crime, and that pulls them back down into the muck. And unfortunately, that is the trend that currently is currently happening in the city, and I don't think this consent decree is going to come to an end.
Well, a lot of people are not optimistic. I mean, when you talk about a consent decree that hasn't really come to fruition in more than 2 decades, I don't know where you can say I'm optimistic. I think a lot of people are saying, listen, you know what? It just pretty much was legalized, and that's it. It just stayed on. It just stayed as a legalized document, but not an enacted document.
Right. Well,
But
that's a great point, because the consent decree is a technical thing, right? It's 20 years
right,
old too. It's the problems that the police department faces now aren't there. Some are similar, but in a way, it is a list. It's a technical list that kind of not a check the boxes list, but it's a set of reforms that's very laid out and legalistic. And in a way, it may not be some of the problems that the police department faces now may be different than what they faced 20 years ago. I mean, society has also changed too. You know, technology has changed tremendously, specifically with regard to what cops use and what they're used to dealing with in their day-to-day investigations. And you know, I think that there's a point at which you have to kind of look at a consent decree as, okay, well, this is a means to an end. It's not the end. And sometimes it's treated as the end, if that makes any sense. And I do believe that the deeper change that needs to come about concerns how the police department is run. I mean, look, Oakland has changed. There is a police commission recently created that does oversee the department now. Previous to that, it was an agency run directly by the city administrator and the mayor, which were, you know, mayors elected, but the city administrators appointed, and there wasn't much insight into it. So the community involvement is really important in terms of making certain that there's some sort of change that happens. And I think that in Oakland, you really have seen this sustained engagement down the years that really is remarkable, and I think has led to a lot of the changes for the better, and hasn't really taken the pressure off the agency to change. And I don't think that there's anybody who believes that the situation in that city is ideal. You know, it still sees far too much gun violence, that still sees a very high rate of violent crime. Homelessness now is a massive problem that ties in with a shortage of housing. It's tremendously problematic and really sad. But the community's involvement in these issues is it's remarkable, and I think something to be noted and applauded.
so for your book, I know that you're excited that it's out, having an opportunity to do some real intense journalism, and not just journalism, but bring to light what's going on in Oakland and some takeaways. Give us, first of all, what you hope that people will take away from the book before we close, and where they can get it.
Certainly. Well, this is what it looks like for anybody who hasn't seen it on your bookshelves. You can find this hopefully at your nearest bookstore, or you can go online. You can go to bookshop.org, IndieBound. If you have to, Amazon. I really don't like that company, but that's me. And you know, what we really hope that people take away from it, first off, we hope it's a good read. We tried not to write this as a policy brief or as a dry academic text, but really as a story of a city. And we wanted to make, for us, Oakland was our main character, right? We wanted to make that community, first of all, we wanted to write a history of the city that is respectful to the place that we wrote about, to the institutions and the people that we wrote about, and also the remarkable things that we've seen down the years. And I hope that readers from across the country get a sense of the place. I think it's a really fascinating, wonderful city that I had a tremendous privilege to report on for so long. And I also hope that they can see the parallels between Oakland and their own cities. We try to kind of pull back where the narrative permits and zoom out to other places, other municipalities that have had their own struggles with police reform and community control over law enforcement. Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, obviously, New Orleans, Washington, D.C. But you know, there are broader questions here. There are broader strains that run through this book about how law enforcement was developed in the country. So California law enforcement is a little bit different. West Coast law enforcement is a little bit different than departments back east. They were developed later. They were not developed off the slave catcher, slave patrol model. They were kind of developed out of a model of like social repression and control of restive populations. I mean, it was such an central institution to the city that OPD's inmates from the city jail were used to kind of lay out the downtown grid in the 19th century. Like they essentially built part of the city. But it was a department very much geared towards, in the early 19th century and early 20th century, towards social control and protection of property. And I think that that's a fundamental character of American law enforcement that we do have to recognize. Yes, that crime and whatnot did become a rationale and a means to an end, a raison d'etre of the profession down the years, in the 20th century. And we take that into account. We deal with the ways in which the police are also shaped not only by their internal prerogatives, but the environment that they're in, right? Like if for instance, when the city starts changing, industrializing and changing in the 1960s and 70s, by the change in actual crime numbers from 1970 to 1980, it's eye-popping. I mean, it was a very different place. And of course, the police changed with regards to that. They get vests, they develop a SWAT team, they purchase armored cars, they purchase, they up armor, they militarize. And that is one thing that, we kind of see towards the end of it, is that really that's a national story, but we tell it through the lens of a city and an institution over the years.
Yeah. Ali, we're gonna have to leave it there because I'm out of time for our segment, but certainly I want to tell you the work that's going on, the investigative journalism, the bringing to light some of the challenges that, not some, but a lot of the challenges gives people a unique perspective into what goes on in Oakland, but also it really is paramount to what's happening today. So I want to thank you for the hard work. I know it was intense and years of putting on with you and your partner, but thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was a pleasure.
All right, Ali Winston, our guest. And listen, you can just get the book. He gave you several places you can get it, including that place that he doesn't like, but everybody kind of gets it. That's Amazon too, right? So you take a chance, go ahead and get the book. That way you can at least be able to see and read some very impactful history for where we are today. Take a quick break. We'll be back with more here on the Social Justice Forum.